Hello. I am here with Bora Chung, author of Cursed Bunny and many other books. And we are going to have a very natural conversation. Yes, that is one of the Korean editions of Cursed Bunny. It's actually an older one. The newer one has a photo of Bora like from the back. You can kind of see her hair covering her face. Whereas for that edition, which is the one that I have as well, it's I couldn't find it. I think it's in another place right now. But so I thought that we could talk about that in a bit and what they're actually expecting us to do is to deliver a kind of like very natural conversation about me translating the very specific story that I'm supposed to do for the residency, which is Muna or octopus. And then I figure we can kind of move on to like each story in the book that I just did with you. I keep emphasizing that this is a very natural conversation because I don't know. Well, it's not as bad with Bora actually because most of the time I don't contact my authors because I feel very strongly about what my authors wrote. Like I have a visceral reaction to, oh, like this is so beautiful. I know exactly what she means here. I know exactly what she's trying to say here, and I'm gonna say it in English. Like, and that's why I translate. That's why I would translate a book like Cursed Bunny because I feel so strongly about it. So it's never like, oh, I wonder what Bora meant by this. Like, it's very kind of rare that I would have that moment. And you're such a clear writer that even when you're being ambiguous, it's clear that you want this to be read in two ways, for example. Then I'm like, oh, then I'm going to translate it so that it could be read in two ways. Like a lot of the stories are scary, but at the same time, they're very funny. Like there's a lot of kind of like that going on, or a story would be kind of like a fairy tale or maybe like a historical story, but it's also very contemporary and very realist. So you could kind of like read all of your stories in completely diametrically opposite ways, and yet they still make sense and they're still coherent. And I'm like, okay, I can. These are things that I can handle, I guess. So I never had to really talk to Bora, but so a lot of my authors kind of like they kind of like are what when they meet me they're like I'm a complete stranger to them, whereas when I meet my authors I'm always very familiar with them because they're always very familiar to me because it's like Bora is sitting across from me on this table, like at this table, and I hope she's not sitting on the table. She's sitting at the table, sorry. And she's telling me these stories and sometimes telling me how to translate them. So I always imagine Bora doing that. So Bora is very familiar to me. But also you and I actually have emailed each other a lot about things that have nothing to do with translation. We're just like randomly email each other a lot. So it's like that's a more natural way for us to communicate, especially with COVID. And so to be talking to you on Zoom, yes, this is very natural. Despite us not doing um sort of to maybe to begin with that, so you've been teaching, right? And
Yes.
on Zoom for the past like year and a half at least. So how's that been for you? Can you maybe talk a little bit about that first?
It's been strange. Well, for the first semester, I didn't use Zoom at all. I made my own videos only using PowerPoint. And that was a bad idea. That was a really bad idea. But during the first semester or the first 6 months of COVID, I wasn't really, I didn't really understand what was going on. And everybody thought this was going to be over in a couple months, 3 months, 4 months. But that stretched far longer than any of us expected. So I was thinking, well, I should just make class material out of PowerPoint because I already have all these materials. Um, so I just recorded my own voice and edited my voice. And that was a pain. and then realized that I have 3 students with disability, some kind of disability or other, and some of them couldn't hear me. So I started writing scripts for each of my class, and each script took about 8 to 20 pages for one single class. And that took a whole lot of time. Everything else was so much easier compared to writing that script. But I turned some of those scripts into research papers, so it all paid off at some point. It's just, I was working until like 4 in the morning. I was always late towards the end of the semester, and it was hell. But one of those students emailed me and said she could understand what was going on because I provided them with the script, whereas in other classes, she just had to try to read lips and hope for the best. And that's just so unfair. And I teach Russian literature, so we have Korean Russians from Russia and former Soviet Union countries, and they, even without disabilities, they don't always understand spoken Korean so clearly. And over Zoom or any other media, it's just hard for them to ask questions right then and there when they don't understand. Whereas in class, you can just raise your hand. So this is just bad in so many ways for so many students, and I don't know. This semester, strangely, I have 0 students with disability, and I started to think, did I do something wrong? Are they like all avoiding me or something? Um, so yeah. But for me, it's the same. I can't ask my students. Like, they're not there in front of me, so I can't like grab them and ask them what's going on. It's frustrating.
Mm-hmm. It's a lot of extra work. Like you were basically, because you were telling me about this while it was happening. I actually I kind of never do, but this time I kind of had a list of questions for you that I was like, oh, I'm curious about. Like I sort of know the answer, but I'm just gonna make sure and ask Bora. And then I was like, hey, Bora, how are you doing? And then you were like, oh, I'm basically writing, filming, and producing a movie every single week this semester. What's up? And then I heard that and I was like, okay, nothing's going on. You do your thing. I'll figure it out. And so I figured it out. And so I just figured it out. And I was like, oh my God, it just sounded so terrible. I'm really glad that those students managed to get access to the aids that they need. But yeah, it really just sounded like so much work for you. And knowing how universities work, I'm not sure if you would have been like helped a lot by your institution. So that was like another big factor, and kind of that kind of segues into our discussion of octopus, because in a lot of ways this story is about the rights of instructors, like college instructors and adjunct instructors. So can you kind of like talk more about that? So just to explain what the story is, because it hasn't been translated yet. I'm sorry, I'm very slow. It's a story about these two people who work who are members of a labor union, and one of them is a college instructor, and the other one he accidentally eats an alien. He eats a couple of aliens. Well, one is kind of like a probe, but still, an alien. And so he eats a couple of aliens by mistake because he thinks that they're octopuses. And the instructor, there are many hilarious moments where she's like, why would you think that there's an octopus wandering around the school, like on dry land? Like, why would you eat that? Like, wouldn't you think that that's a little weird? And there's a lot of like, yeah, moments like that. But basically, they're also doing a sit-in protest where they're trying to get better rights for adjunct instructors in the schools. And there's a lot of like really succinct and very like good explanations about what the situation is like for adjunct instructors and why these adjunct professors are being so stressed and being squeezed out at the same time. Like, if there's such a high demand for classes, why are they firing these adjunct professors? And I thought that it was a very good explanations of that of counterintuitive situations like that in the story, which I can't wait for people to read. So, what was kind of like the impetus behind writing about that part of the story?
Because I go to these sit-in protests, and I actually wrote the first 2 pages, I think, during the sit-in protests at night. It was at one of the university. Well, they won, so I'm gonna say out loud. It was Joseon University. It's in Jeollado, and they were actually doing something more serious than the things that I wrote. The generic things are horrible enough, but this particular university, they closed their physics department. First of all, they closed their, so on top of firing all these adjunct professors while leaving all the classes there, so like there are half the number of professors who have to teach the same number of students, and that's a problem in and of itself. And then they close the physics department on top of that, and they try to force the physics professors to teach disaster management. So they try to create this disaster management department, which is subsidized by the government. So the university wanted that money, but they didn't want to spend extra money hiring actual disaster management professionals. So they just thought, well, these are professors, so you go teach that class, which has nothing to do with your field of specialty. And the physics professor is like, what? And they didn't ask any of the actual faculty members or the students. The school just made the decision and just closed the department one day, overnight. So the graduates, the current students, their parents, the faculty members, all of them, graduate students, they all started this sit-in protest with the other adjunct professors who had their own problems. And the solidarity was beautiful, but the situation was just it was the worst that I've seen. I've never seen a university close down a physics department. Like, this is not the Russian literature department. Nobody gets a job when we graduate, but this is the physics department. You can get a job anywhere. And it's basic science. Like, any university in the world needs a physics department. And they close it down. And how are you going to manage disasters? How are you going to understand how building structures work when there's no physics department? How are you going to teach your students basic physics? So yeah, that was the situation. And the head of the labor union there was on his 370 something days. So he was on that sit-in protest for over a year. He was in pain. Like, he was physically in pain. You start living in a corridor of a school building, then you start aches and pains everywhere. So that's a chapter of our general labor union for adjunct professors. So I went there and spent the night there, and we did all the protests with them, and the graduate students from the former physics department told me all these stories. It's just so yeah. So that's when I started writing Octopus at night.
Was it?
And there were giant mosquitoes too, like giant, humongous mosquitoes.
So you were going down all the way to Gwangju for this. Were you going there regularly?
No, it was just that one time because it
Okay.
was the 300th 380th day or
I see.
370th day or
Hmm.
something like that.
Hmm. Wow. So, and that's not where you live. I just want to emphasize to the audience, it's a city
That
that's
was
very far
the
away
first
from.
time I've ever been in Gwangju
Oh,
in my
really?
life.
Mm.
Yes.
On a very auspicious occasion. Great. So, was there? But what was it about? Was that like the? Was that the reason why you wrote this story, or was there another reason?
Well, I was obviously in love.
Hmm.
I had a crush on the head of my general labor union. Um, I had a crush on him ever since I first met him in 2016,
Hmm.
and we were trying to get this law, this bill passed, so that we would be legally protected as teachers, as instructors, and we were staging a sit-in protest in front of the National Assembly, and he was there every night, practically every night. He practically lived there for 3 months, and I was the Friday person. So I went there every Friday in the morning, and he would be like sleeping in the tent,
Hmm.
like snoring aloud,
Hmm.
and nobody could wake him up. So the situation was tragic, and I felt really guilty that he had to spend every single night there, basically sleeping on the pavement.
Hmm.
I couldn't even imagine. But
Hmm.
when I went there in the morning, like he's like sprawled all over the tent and sleeping and snoring, and like beer cans all over the place.
Hmm.
It was hilarious.
So it's
So
just like in
yeah,
the
it
story.
was that kind of tragic comic situation.
Mm.
And the bill passed, and then the university started to lay off more adjunct professors, so things got worse.
Hmm.
It always gets worse.
Mm. So it's kind of like the situation in the story as it begins is kind of like a combination of those two.
Yep.
Yeah. Okay. So, so he was so he- so it was right outside the National Assembly walls, right? Was that where the tent was, or
Yeah, that was 2019. Yes.
okay? Yeah. Whew. So so I was because I know because when I was reading, I was like, oh, this is like this is basically what must have happened, except for the alien octopus thing. I don't know if you're allowed to talk about the alien octopus thing that actually did happen to you, but I was like, oh yeah, so this is a very personal story, um, and I felt like it was more. I'm sure all of your stories are personal on some level, but I felt like this story was kind of like personal on a more surface level, shall we say, where I could be like, oh, I can kind of like imagine you being in these situations and talking in this way. Um, how do you what do you think about that? So is it do you think it's more do you think it is like with your stories? Um, there are a lot of fantastical situations, and there is a fantastical situation in the story. But do you feel like this story is a bit more personal for you than it would be for your other stories that are out there, or not really?
Um, well, this is, I think you said it at one point. This is the first time I ever openly talked about my labor union movement, uh, me being a member of a labor union, and me doing stuff for myself, for my own future career. So, in that respect, it is personal, but I don't think it's more personal than any of my other stories.
Hmm. The I totally also get the tragicomic aspect of the situation because that's also what I kind of like detected all the whole time. Like there's some very mysterious intelligence agency kind of like takes both the labor union leader and the adjunct instructor, the adjunct professor, and then they they're interrogated, and it should be very creepy and like disturbing, but the interrogation is actually kind of comical at the end because they're very frustrated. They're like, "Why would you eat that? Why would you eat the alien?" Like,
It's so good.
yeah,
Octopuses are so good.
yeah, because it looks like an octopus. They're because octopuses are so smart. There's like a theory that they're actually not from Earth and they're kind of like aliens who came to Earth and kind of devolved or something. But yeah, so everything like the metaphors kind of like fit together, and also the whole situation where yes, he has been in a sit-in protest tent under very dire conditions, but it's also like very funny that especially when his alarm goes off and there are like labor union songs and the
That actually happened.
oh yeah, that was such a funny
Yeah,
moment. It's like a very
that happened every single week, every time I went there.
it's like a very depressing moment, but it's also really funny, and I think that is a very hallmark of like the Bora Chung experience. Um,
My life.
the other thing about I noticed about this story, now that we got all the personal stuff out of the way, the other thing I noticed about this story is that the sentences are very long, and I really love that because it's really funny. It's like like it's so funny because it's like there's so much information to impart, and by making it like this very long run-off sentence and very kind of it's also very funny because she would say these things that are so unjust that are happening to her or the situation, but she would say it in a very funny way that you sympathize with it, but you're not like bogged down with it at the same time. Like like so you come out with an understanding of like her situation is really bad and what they're doing to adjunct professors is really unjust, but at the same time it's like entertaining to read. So I was wondering about like how you was there like an intention behind writing these long sentences and listing all of these things because it's not something that I really found you do in Cursed Bunny the book. So I thought this was something a bit different. Like, was there something behind that?
I do like undermining the whole thing in the end, and you can do that with the Korean language. Like you can give so much information in the beginning, and then in the end you say, but I can't really say this out loud, or you're not supposed to know this, or anything, something like that. So I do like that, and all the stuff about the adjunct being and working as an adjunct and all of the labor situations and stuff, those are the kind of things that I've been familiar with for the last 4 or 5 years.
Mm-hmm.
So that came out very naturally, but that's also that's the kind of information that I learned. The whole thing, the big picture, so to speak. I don't have an understanding of it, how the whole structure works. I only know my own situation. So when I'm describing the entire situation, the entire structure, then the entire thing has to come out because I don't know where to cut and how to edit the information. It's kind of memorizing the whole thing and then regurgitating, something like that. But also, in certain parts, I wanted to do like this babbling about the entire thing and then saying, "Oh, but I'm not going to say that out loud." So undermining the entire sentence or sometimes the entire paragraph.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I thought it was very effective. It's kind of tricky to translate, like just like what Bora mentioned for the natural listening audience, just like what Bora mentioned. In Korea, the predicate, which is what we refer to the verb, the verb basically comes at the end of the sentence. So many people say the verb basically decides the nature of the sentence, right? And so you can completely twist expectations and of how that sentence will turn out or what you're going to say by doing a little twist at the end with with the predicate. And although something what Bora is actually doing in the story, and again, I wish I had time to translate the whole thing before, so that I can illustrate it. But what Bora is doing with the story is actually more sophisticated than what I just described. It really is what Bora said, like, oh, but I'm not allowed to talk about this, or like there's like a little bit of like information like put at the very end, which kind of um, makes you think like, oh, like it's a very like cool twist at the end, and there are like several moments in the story where this happens, and I thought it was very very kind of um, very like a very interesting rhetorical device, because the other thing about what happens in the story is that there's some kind of like inside the octopus aliens, there's something dark, and there's like and it's like a hard thing, and it's like either covered in the squid ink, or it's like inside the squid ink's like squid ink bladder, or whatever it's called, the gland. And at some point, the adjunct professor character, she finds it in the alien, and then she holds it in her hands, and it's like there's squid ink everywhere. And I thought that was a very interesting image, because when you think of squid ink, it's very black. Of course, it's like real ink, and we call it ink in English. And you write with it, and you can write a lot of things with it. But just because you write about something, it doesn't mean that you are explaining something or revealing something. It could mean that you're obscuring something. And if you pour a whole bunch of ink on a piece of paper, you're basically blotting it out. And so she's holding this hard thing, and the reading audience is like, what is it? What is it? Like, how does it work? And it's never quite explained how it works, and why the intelligence officers like why they want to, like, they kind of explain what it is, but not very specifically. And it's not, but it's very clear that these intelligence officers, like, they really want that hard thing, and they're like looking for it. And so I thought that was a very cool kind of metaphor in the story. Am I reading it correctly, or in your mind, is there like a very clear purpose to the hard object that they find in the squid?
No, it was just a random thing that came out on its own. And it's clear, in my mind, it's very clear that for the narrator, the most important thing is her love interest. And for her love interest, the most important thing is ramen. This hard thing is just irrelevant. You can't eat it. You can't decipher it. You can't use it in a protest, except maybe haul it against the university president or something. I don't know. But it's useless piece of metal. And I think it's something mundane, like alien civilization or information about the universe or something like that. And whatever it is, it's not anything you can understand unless you're an astrophysicist. So it's completely irrelevant. And the government agency, of course, they want it. But for all the mundane reasons that you've seen in all of 100 years of history of sci-fi, you can just guess, and whatever your guess is, it's gonna be more or less correct. So, ramen. Yep.
Yeah, like ramen, of course, is a symbol of sustenance, but it's also it's what people who don't have a lot of money have to survive on, basically. So yeah, of course, but I didn't really think about any of those things while I was writing Octopus. I was actually thinking about the real protest tents that I've been in, and they have these portable stoves, and they actually they cook ramen in there because it's just convenient. We had our own little portable stove, and my then head of the union
used to make coffee and tea and actually cook ramen for us there. And I thought, like, the sit-in protest, the whole purpose of the sit-in protest is to end the protest and get what we want. And it seems like he's trying to just settle down and live here. You're not supposed to get too comfortable, and he was really comfortable in that tent.
I'm sure
that amazed me.
I'm sure the intention was to show everyone that, oh, I'm willing to sit here for as long as it takes. So don't think that you're gonna kick me out of here.
He was actually comfortable.
Okay. Well, I'm glad he was comfortable, at least.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm glad. Like, and he's not there anymore. So
no, but he's on another protest.
Okay.
Right as we speak.
Oh no! Is it a sit-in protest?
Yeah, May is the protest month.
Oh right.
So,
yes.
Yeah.
Yes, May
May
is
Day
the
and
protest
everything. So yeah.
Right. Right. So, really, that's like it for the things that I was curious about of this story. I just like really enjoyed it. I love like 지구 생물체는 항복하라, surrender Earthling. It's like and how you use it at the end to be like, no, I'm not going to surrender. We're going to keep protesting until we get what we need. And how you kind of like twist that into that. I thought that was very cool. So yeah, there are a lot of this is kind of like minor, but Bora and I have collaborated for an anthology of translated horror fiction that is also coming out. They were emailing me and they were asking me like, does she go by a different name? And I was like, oh, what do you mean? And they looked up the story in Korean, and it has your other pen name on it, Chung Do-kyung. And so I just wanted to like ask you about this alter ego. So I do know that you've published a couple of books under this other name before, and I kind of like wanted to ask you, why did you change your name, like in the middle of your career, for Curse Bunny, for example, and why did you keep your name for publishing Octopus in Korean?
The original intention was to have a pen name for my creative works and use my real name for my translation, because my translation also overlaps with my research career.
I see.
But that failed. That failed. So what you're looking at is the result, the failure. My mom. It was my mom's idea, and she actually went to a fortune teller, paid her $100 or so to get this name, Chung Do-kyung. And I tried to use it, but the publishers wanted my credentials, that I have a PhD from a major American university, blah, blah, blah. And so they wanted that on my bio. So that's why I failed. And a couple of the publishers actually published it under my pen name, and then in the bio said, well, her real name is Bora Chung, and that just defeats the purpose.
Okay. Chung Do-kyung, also known as Bora Chung.
Exactly.
Okay. Yeah, I get that a lot. I think like all the Korean funding bodies know my Korean name, and so they keep using my Korean name in things, and I'm like, no, I'm Anton Hur, but so it's like it's very like screwed up that way. The way like they used my the like New Yorker magazine actually talked about Korean translators for an article, and they used my Korean name and not Anton Hur. So I was like, oh, I almost got into the New Yorker, but not really. That's really interesting. Do you feel like that's also kind of, is there a very clear separation for you between your research career and your translation career and your writing career?
Well, research career and translation career, no. I translate, and while I'm translating, I see some good subjects for my research paper, and then I usually write something, write a research paper about the works that I translated. So that's very natural, and those two processes work very well together. But my creative works, they are completely separate, and um, I wouldn't mind having a different name and a totally different identity for only for my creative work, because it's just it's a separate life and a very different kind of thinking.
Well, that's interesting because there are a lot of translator writers, and um, like for many of them, it kind of like feeds into each other. But that you feel a separation, that's very interesting. The other thing with this particular aspect of your process, the fact that you do both, is that so whenever I am messaging you and emailing you before COVID, you would be like, "Oh, I'm at a protest," and back when you were on Twitter, I was like, until I followed you on Twitter, like I had no idea there were that many protests going on in Kuala like every week. And indeed, the first time my husband met you was during Seoul Pride, which is another kind of protest. And so because you kind of like popped out of nowhere, and then you said hi, and then you like ran away. And my husband was like, "Who was that? She was so cheerful and nice." And I was like, "Oh, that's Bora." So like yeah, so it was really funny for me when you were kind of like handing out invitations to the book launch for The Red Sword. And I was like, when did you write this? Are you writing while you're protesting? And like, wow, where do you find the time to write this? So I kind of, I kind of wanted to ask you your process, your writing process, because you do so many things. You're a teacher, you're a researcher, you are a translator, and you do all these protests. And so, like, how do you find the time to write? What inspires you to write? And how do you get around to writing, basically?
Once I get the idea, once I get the central idea and the ending of the story, then and well, first I get the ending, and then or I get an image and then I get the ending, and then I think about the first sentence, and as soon as I get the first sentence and the ending, then the rest just writes itself. So it takes me the longest to find the first sentence. And the central image and the ending is easier. Those two are easier. And I actually do get a lot of ideas from going to protests because that's when I see real life stories of real people, and real life stories that are mostly heartbreaking, but sometimes like little situations there are really funny. And the interactions could be absurd or funny or enraging and so unjust and unfair, or it could be sad. And I ever since I started doing these protests for the Seoul family, I think I experienced the entire range of possible emotions that a human being could possibly feel. And I don't like that. I do not wish that upon anybody except for the enemies of the people. But that inspires me, those situations, those real life situations, and my own interpretations of the situations, because I do realize that my own interpretations are very often far from what other people mostly see. So yeah, and add a little spice like the alien.
Yeah. So I guess I have two questions about that. The first is you mentioned humor and that there are little situations where you kind of like find humor, or there are these absurd situations where like, and so I thought that is a hallmark of your stories, I think. Of course, there are stories that are not, humorous, but I think what really drew me to your work is that, oh, this is a Korean author who really understands humor and can write about it. Because I think this type of humor, like this type of ironic humor, is not very, very common in Korean literature. There are writers who can do it, like Chung Young-soo is very funny, but which was why it was just so pleasant for me to read and why I wanted to translate it, because I think the English language is very kind of it's very good with irony, and English readers are very like keen on looking at absurd situations and humorous situations. So I was kind of wondering, where did this interest in humor come from? Do you think, or and like how you use it in your work, like
The
how,
interest in humor, I don't know. I don't know, but it probably has something to do with being a woman in Korea in a very patriarchal society, very male oriented. Either you go crazy or you have to laugh at something. You have to learn to laugh at things, or you go crazy, and be a ghost, and be full of Han, and that kind of thing. I don't want to do that. I want to keep on living my life. So
mm-hmm.
yeah.
It's I see. And the other thing is, you said that and sometimes you like spiced it up with like an element of kind of maybe fantasy, or like an element of some kind of speculative fiction. So I do notice that in your stories, where it's an otherwise, a social realist story, but then there'll be one thing that would kind of like magic it up a bit. So my question basically is, I think it's cool, but as a writer, like, why do you think you do that, or why do you do that?
Because it's more fun. Otherwise, real
I mean, it
life
is.
is just so mundane,
Mm-hmm.
and banal things don't interest readers.
Mm-hmm.
It does. Mundane things don't interest me.
And because there are other, I think because there's so much skepticism against, genre fiction elements I mean, in English literature as well as Korean literature, and there's a lot of like that kind of, how do I say this, like disdain for speculative fiction elements. Were you ever kind of steered away from it, or were you ever kind of told, no, you should concentrate on being a social realist writer, or was that never like a thing for you, do you
Well,
think?
my ex-boyfriend in college told me once that I should write more real stories, but I ignored him, and eventually dumped him. So that's
Good,
that.
excellent.
That was in the 20th century,
Mhm.
and uh, I don't think I fully understand human beings. Or when I was younger, I thought I didn't understand the Korean society, and I didn't understand Koreans, why they act the way they act and why they think the way they think. Even though I am Korean, I always felt like I was an outsider visiting this place and not understanding half the things that I couldn't understand. And I lived abroad for some time, and I realized I don't really understand anybody. I don't understand the humankind. Wherever I go, I just don't understand. So um, that's where the humor and the magic comes from, because essentially I just don't understand what's going on, and things look irrational and illogical to me, and that's just a small step away from magical, or I guess magical or supernatural. So and supernatural and magical things are fun too. So yeah, as I feel it, the real life is not that far from the irrational element of being.
Yeah, good answer. The so there are kind of like two kinds of stories in Cursed Bunny. So one is I guess what we just mentioned about it kind of being like a realism story, but then with supernatural elements like Home Sweet Home, I think, and the head and the embodiment, etc. But there are also stories that are like full on fantasy, like Snare, which is, I believe, going to appear in the Berlin Quarterly in shortly, and also the really long one, Scar. Sorry, I can't remember what the what the Korean titles are because it's kind of like been a while since I read the Korean version. But and also, of course, Ruler of the Winds and Sands, which I just really love as a story, and readers keep telling me about it. They just love the heroine, and they love how the story turns out. Um, so these are more closer to maybe like straight out fantasy or fairy tales even. What is the motivation behind writing those kinds of stories as opposed to the realism stories?
I love fantasy. I love fairy tale. I just love fairy tales and legends and those kind of stories. As a child, I read 삼국유사. I don't know the English translation of the title, but so basically it's about the Showa dynasty, and it's there are two books about the history of Showa dynasty. One is the real history, and the other one is the unnatural, the unreal, the uncanny, the supernatural things. And 삼국유사 is the supernatural one. And I just love those stories. And I loved how the narrator writes as though it really happened. And I was just fascinated. And then I started studying Russian literature in grad school, and I read a lot. And after I started teaching, I had to read a lot of Russian fairy tales for class, and they were beautiful, and they were different, and they were so much fun. So fairy tales are awesome. I love fairy tales, and that's what I wanted to write. That's what I always want to write: a really good fairy tale or a really good horror story. I never really consciously wanted to write science fiction or anything real or any kind of criticism, social comment or anything. I just wanted to write a really scary, good story. Yeah.
Yeah, I think there's only one science fiction story in Cursed Bunny,
Yep.
and it's kind of like a fairy tale, as much as it is
Is it?
also. Yeah, I feel like because it's kind of it's the one about the robots.
Yeah.
Because
It's actually about my first cell phone
oh
because my cell phone died.
oh yeah, I feel very sentimental about my cell phones that die. Like I think I still own every single cell phone I ever owned. Like
Yeah,
they're
I do
still
too.
yeah, they're kind of part of you. You
Yeah.
can't you can't let go of them. Yeah. So yeah, so that's really interesting. Would you be interested in writing a book of fairy tales someday?
Yes.
Mhm.
Yes. But now that I'm going to protests every single week. Well, I didn't go to any protests last week. But this Saturday I'm going. So now that I'm doing that, I don't think I can fully go back to fairy tale mode. It's gonna be hard.
Do you kind of like need to be immersed in, like, need to have a
Yes.
big stretch of time to write
Yep.
that? Okay.
Well, not well. This stretch of time, well, depends on the scale of the story, but I need to have psychological distance from reality. And when I go to a protest, it's usually because somebody died, and that impacts me. That has a great impact on me, and and I just can't distance myself, even though I have time, and even though I am physically distant from where it happened. Psychologically, I carry it on my mind until the problem is resolved. But even after that, it's still a fact that that person died a very horrible death, and the circumstances were so unfair, and things are so unfair for the family too, and those things are happening more and more. So I don't think I can go back to that fairy tale thinking where everything is magical and I don't have to worry about the real life.
I see. There is I feel like with artists, they have a kind of sensitivity and empathy that enables them to create the work that they create. But at the same time, it's kind of like a double-edged sword where it also makes you more sensitive um, to the tragedy of others. And so it makes it very difficult kind of for artists to live in the world. Do you feel like that's kind of something that you
Well,
experience, or
you're what you're describing as a normal human being who has empathy.
you know that's not true. You know there are people who like have no empathy, who don't
They can
care.
die. They can go to the gutter and die.
Yeah.
I don't know. I don't know, and I don't want to disrespect the deceased by writing a story about them.
Mhm.
But the impact just lives with me, and sometimes the impact, not the real story, but the impact turns into a story sometimes. But other times, it just pisses me off and I go to another protest.
Do you feel like so it's not so your stories aren't really like an escapism from reality? It's kind of like a way to process that kind of impact, do you think?
Yep. Yeah.
Even like maybe even the fairy tale stories are in some way trying to process, because I think that's like a theory that people have about children's literature, that there's a lot of violence in fairy tales, including your own fairy tales, and there's a lot of violence, and that's because the world is violent and children are very unnerved by it, so they want to look, if by reading it they're kind of warned against the violence, but in a way that does not harm them psychologically. Do you feel like that's something that's going on in your writing?
Yeah, I guess. Sometimes I just want to escape. Like the snare, when I wrote the snare, I wanted to simply write a good, maybe Japanese style urban legend horror story. That's what I wanted to write. And it didn't come out as an urban legend, but I like it. I like the result, and it's the most removed from reality among all the stories in Cursed Bunny, I think.
I think what about Scar?
Scar?
Yeah. I kind of felt like it was an allegory for abuse, or like how not just children are abused, but also society abuses children. So do you think it's kind of like very close to reality, despite the fact that it's very a fairy tale kind of story? Or
Yeah, well, it is a fairy tale story where the hero, the central character, prevails, and then he doesn't. I guess this is very, very personal. That's all I can say. This is very
Okay.
personal.
Sure. Sure. Yeah, I also know exactly what you mean by, because the way it kind of ends, it doesn't end the way that normal fairy tales, usual fairy tales usually end, where the hero vanquishes the monster. There's a very odd moment around the end where the hero actually feels sympathy for the monster, kind of like a vague sympathy kind of for the monster, and I thought that was like, wow, this is a very interesting moment. And it's another story that some people who've read the book, although it's being released in July, quite a few people have read early galleys of it, and they talk about like that story because it doesn't quite fit into how they thought it would end, and yet it's so emotionally affecting and very dark. I remember at Onford Star, Sojay, who translated Choi Jin Young's To the Warm Horizon. The one of the editors tweeted like, "Oh, I want to read an Octavia Spencer, not Octavia Spencer. Oh God, Octavia Butler book." And can anyone recommend me? And we were both like, "Oh, read Kindred." And he was like, "Oh, these are," and then he looked at Kindred. He's like, "Oh, this looks like really dark. I just came off of editing Cursed Bunny and To the Warm Horizon, and I need something slightly lighter." And Sojay was like, "Wow, like Anton, we've broken Onford Star." Uh, yeah, it's very very affecting. But also, of course, the book, Cursed Bunny, at least, it has a lot of very light moments, which I feel like helps us kind of process the darker moments of the book. I think our time is almost up, so I want to ask you about your future plans, whether writing or translation, or like what are you working on now, and what are you looking forward to being released?
I'm working on Maxim Gorky's Mother, which is the reddest of the red bugs. It's the ultimate communist propaganda. And I love it. I love the way Gorky writes. And I have to revise one of my former stories. I wrote a novella last year in February, I think, and I showed it to Arzak, and they didn't really like parts of it. So you were there when we were talking about it. So I'm supposed to revise it, but I haven't been able to do it with all the teaching and everything else. But yeah, I'm planning to do that. But it's a very dark story, and I think that's why Arzak doesn't like it, because it's dark and it doesn't give any relief in the end. And that's how I intended it. So it's going to be a little bit of a problem. I want it to be as dark as it can be, and Arzak doesn't really deal with that.
Yeah. Do you know how you're gonna solve the conundrum?
No.
Maybe there could be a cat. No, okay. It was just a random suggestion. Okay. Okay, so I think that is about that has been about an hour. Is that of this very natural conversation that we're having between us? The Oh God, what was I going to ask? Oh, I wanted to ask you if you had any questions that you wish that people would ask you, or you would like to ask me or to the listening audience.
Not really. I do want to emphasize that none of my stories are allegories. I don't do allegories. I say what I mean.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's because I feel like if you read them as allegories, they would. I don't think they even like how would you even read, for example, the head as an allegory? Like, be nicer to a head that pops out in your toilet, or like, right? Like I feel like it's much more interesting to experience your stories as they are. They are a situation, and of course, they do symbolize certain things, I'm sure. But those kind of interpretations I find are very personal and not necessarily ones that are intended by the author. So yeah. Although I do understand that because some of them are fairy tales, and fairy tales are very easy to allegorize in interpretation, but let's not do that. And also, I think Bora's fairy tales, especially the way they end, kind of resists allegorization. Because if they were allegories, they would have not clearer endings. The endings are very clear. They would have more like a resolution of, oh, this is good and this is evil. Like there would be more binaries that are going down by the end, that are resolved by the end of the story. And a lot of the like some of the fairy tales, they don't really like resolve themselves that cleanly. For example, even like Ruler of the Winds and Sands, like it kind of does have a fairy tale ending, but he offers her immortality, and she's like, "Oh, no, thank you. I'm, yeah, I'm good. Yeah, you do." Like, I love how the story ends like that, and the guy does not get angry at her. He's like, oh, "Okay, do you want to ride back home?" And she's like, "Oh, yes. Can you do that for me?" And so he gives her a ride back home on his flying ship. Like, oh, that's such a nice, like, cool ending. And I mean, what is that an allegory for? Nothing. It's not an allegory. Yeah, so I thought that was very cool. Um, Bora, thank you so much for doing this with us.
Oh, thank you.
Yes, and thanks to the Queen's College Translation Exchange at the University of Oxford, a very long name that I finally mastered. Thanks to Translation Exchange very much for hosting, and we hope that you will pick up a copy of Cursed Bunny when it comes out in July, and any future works that Bora will publish. So thank you very much, and goodbye.